либо-либо.
The sounds you just heard come from a remarkable rodent, the blind mole rat. It lives solely on the ground. Naturally, I couldn't resist this story because its cousin, as you may recall, is my spirit animal, the naked mole rat, and it happens to be the namesake of this Libo Studio podcast about scientific discoveries and the people who make them. This is Ilya Kolmanovsky. Hello. I should note, though, that naked mole rats live in East Africa, while blind mole rats inhabit steppes of Eurasia. Blind mole rats are fascinating creatures. They're huge for rodents, the length of an adult-sized sneaker, and can weigh up to 1 kilo. The blind mole rat's head is shaped a bit like a shovel. They use it to dig, and it's completely covered in smooth fur. Their eyes completely hidden under the skin and fur, so it's just a furry shovel, nothing else. They're actually a subfamily with about half a dozen species scattered across Eurasia. And so today, our story begins like this. 10,000 years ago, one species of blind mole rat was burrowing in the sands of Central Asia. This mole rat species had come from somewhere in the east and was slowly making its way westward, generation by generation. Eventually, it ran up against the Dnipro River and halted on the river's left bank, that is, the eastern bank. They can't swim. The river created a barrier these small animals could not overcome. That's the origin story of this endemic species, which has one of the smallest habitats of any mammal, measuring less than 200 square kilometers dotted over a slightly larger total range. Nowadays, this blind mole rat species is going extinct and can only be found in one nature reserve. The thing is that in order for the world to realize this species exists, it required a name. And for that, in turn, people had to come find it. Zoologists had to discover it and describe it, explain how it differs from other species, place a collection of its skulls in a museum, and keep the specimens safe. That skull collection is actually the key point here. This is how scientific zoology works. If a collection like this is created, if there's a prototype, a standard for the species, a measuring stick, then that species becomes scientific fact. We'll discuss this in more detail later, but for now, let's get back to our blind mole rat. There's no way this blind mole rat could have known 10,000 years ago, when it dug its way through what is now Ukraine, that the zoologists who would one day describe it and give it a name would later live through the torture chambers of the Gestapo, the torture chambers of the Soviet secret police NKVD, Gulag labor camps, the collapse of the USSR, the 2014 Russian takeover of parts of Ukraine, and the Russian full-scale invasion of 2022 and the war that followed. The zoologists we'll be discussing today passed through every circle of hell, but managed to retain and preserve these blind mole rat specimens. So, today's episode deals with the inseparable connection between the fate of a scientist and the fate of the particular part of the natural world they are studying.
My name is Igor, surname Zagorodnyuk. I work at the National Museum of Natural History of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine.
That is Igor Zagorodnyuk, a zoologist and science historian from Kiev. You'll hear about his life story, which of course involves the blind mole rat, a little later. But for now, Igor will help us build our timeline. We'll start from the moment of the first capture, because in zoology, that's a key point. Animals must be captured and studied. Otherwise, they sort of don't exist as far as science is concerned. So, how does one go about catching a blind mole rat?
There are several methods. The simplest way is to open up its burrow. You wait until the mole rat comes to close it, to plug it with a soil stopper, then you open the burrow again, clear away the soil above the burrow and set a shovel ready in the ground. Then you stay there and wait for the mole rat to come back to push the soil out once again, and this is when you block the tunnel with your shovel.
But keep in mind, this isn't for the faint of heart.
They bite hard. They're very aggressive. They growl, they snap their teeth. That's why they're called puppies, actually. It's what they're called colloquially in Ukraine. Zinska szczenia literally means little earth dog. I can't pronounce the Hungarian version, but it translates to earth dog. It's great. People call them that because they come from underground and they're biters. They're angry, they growl, they hiss constantly.
So, the blind mole rat we'll be talking about today was caught in 1934 with, going off of Igor's description, certain risk to personal safety by an extraordinary woman, a young, steely-gazed zoologist from Kiev named Yevdokia Reshetnik. That field season, she was working in a sandy area near where Dnipro River empties into the Black Sea. Yevdokia Reshetnik saw that her catch was no ordinary blind mole rat. At that point, she was sensing a discovery on the horizon. So she gathered a collection of 30 skulls, which is the first thing you need to do in this kind of situation. Then she returned home to Kiev. A local zoologist named Velikanov had already made some collections of that peculiar creature's bones. In 1938, though, he was executed by firing squad for his wide guard past. All that remained of him were his collections. As we spoke via Zoom, Igor Zagorodnyuk showed me Velikanov's ornate signature, which Velikanov, as the collector, wrote in blue ink directly on the bones. After Velikanov was killed, our steely-gazed Yevdokia Reshetnik figured out it's time to quickly arrange a new expedition to the Dnipro River bank, while it was still clear how to find that blind mole rat. There, she collected some more specimens and took them back to Kiev. She carefully studied the structure of the skull, teeth, and even the penis bone of this blind mole rat from those sands on the left bank of the Dnipro River, and concluded that this was a distinct subspecies. From that point, the story of its coronation as Ukraine's most symbolic animal begins. In 1940, the skulls of that unusual blind mole rat were sent on loan from a Kiev museum to a Moscow museum to the zoologist Sergei Ognev, to the capital of the USSR. I myself did my PhD research in the same building where Ognev worked at the Zoological Museum of Moscow State University, so in my mind's eye, I can see right there, among very tall oak cabinets, packed with specimens under 15-foot-tall ceilings, one of the world-leading experts sat compiling a multi-volume description of all the mammal species across the USSR. And he had been intrigued by Reshetnik's report of unusual blind mole rats found only in a small area in Ukraine. But in this line of work, you can't judge a specimen's rank or its distance from related species before seeing them. You need to actually hold the bones in your hands to know whether you're dealing with an actual separate species. Over the course of your career, you will handle thousands of skulls, such as the work of a zoologist specializing in classification. Therefore, the blind mole rat skulls had to be sent from Kiev to Moscow to be shown to experts.
The thing is, whenever he provides descriptions and illustrations, he always lists specimens he's actually held in his hands, and he provides drawings of the original specimens. He would write, drawing based on specimen so-and-so from collection year such and such. And Ognev said that, based on Reshetnik's collection, she was right, but had underestimated the taxonomic rank when she says it's a subspecies. He recognized that the rank of these specimens was higher because he had access to materials from a much broader geographical area. He had specimens of the giant blind mole rat from the southern Urals, plus the greater blind mole rat. He had Balkan samples and so on. And he believed that the subspecies described by Reshetnik was actually a separate species.
And thus, in a Moscow office with towering ceilings surrounded by giant dark wood cabinets smelling of formaldehyde and mothballs, the fate of our blind mole rat was decided. Ognev established that it was a distinct species. From that moment on, the skulls ceased to be just skulls and became the holotype, that is, the reference specimen, the standard. The species status now depended on these skulls staying safe in their boxes. The sandy blind mole rat, in Latin it's called Spalax arenarius, is an endemic species of Ukraine and one of the symbols of its biodiversity. Nowadays, it even appears on Ukrainian commemorative coins. I've mentioned this idea before, that if there are no collections, then the species sort of doesn't exist. Now is the perfect time to explore this point a little further. Let's say the kilogram and its international prototype in Paris probably require no explanation. Without the prototype, the world wouldn't have a precise, singular reference point for what a kilo weighs, and gradually all the scales everywhere would start showing inconsistent weights. In the 18th century, the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus had a similar realization about biodiversity. Living on Earth, we're surrounded by an infinite number of various organisms. Some might have local nicknames, but if we want to really know, study, and protect this diversity, we have to classify it into species. To isolate a species, we need to identify distinct characteristics that distinguish it from other closely related species. And that's another reason why reference specimens in the museums are so necessary. For example, that guy Ognev in Moscow says, from now on, we have this species, the sandy blind mole rat. Okay, so since it's a species, rather than just some separate population of another species, we need to recognize that its habitat is tiny and that it's therefore a very rare species. In that case, it immediately becomes deserving of special protection. And going forward, to resolve any disputes about this species, we have a measuring stick, a Parisian kilogram, a reference specimen, or, as zoologists call it, a holotype. So, back to our story. In the case of the sandy blind mole rat, the holotype was a specific skull collected in 1934 by that executed zoologist Velikanov, then described and added to the collection by zoologist Yevdokia Reshetnik, then studied by zoologist Ognev in Moscow in 1940, and by the start of the World War II, stored by Reshetnik at the Zoological Institute in Kiev. To even better unpack this idea of a holotype, I'll tell you about one other holotype, a holotype of an elephant. Come with me on a brief excursion. It's actually a great anecdote. So, Carl Linnaeus invented this classification system, described a huge number of species, and solved many problems. For example, he proposed not classifying whales as fish. But unfortunately, he didn't distinguish between the Asian elephant and the African elephant. Nowadays, we know these are two very different and not even particularly closely related species. But back then, Linnaeus had only ever seen a few elephants in Europe and paid little attention to where they'd been shipped from. At some point, Linnaeus studied the materials of the Dutch pharmacist Albertus Seba. Seba had extensive collections, a whole cabinet of curiosities. And Seba's collection included an elephant fetus, preserved in alcohol. Linnaeus studied this specimen and named the fetus Elephas maximus. From that moment on, this preserved fetus became the species holotype. It would seem this was good news for elephants, but a little while later things took a bad turn. The next generation of zoologists looked into elephants some more and realized that the Asian elephant was nothing like the African elephant. These days, it's common knowledge that they are as distant from each other in terms of genetics as humans are from chimpanzees. They were given separate names. That Latin title, Elephas maximus, was assigned to the Asian elephant, which meant that that specimen from Seba's collection was no longer the holotype of some abstract elephant. It was a holotype of Asian elephant. That baby elephant is still housed at the Museum of Natural History in Stockholm. Only it turned out that this was the wrong baby elephant. A few years ago, a group of scientists analyzed the proteins from this alcohol-preserved elephant calf from Seba's collection and discovered that it was in fact the fetus of an African elephant. So, the next logical question is, where is the Asian elephant holotype? Which museum has it? And what is it? A skin? A skeleton? This might seem funny to you because of course you would be able to tell an Asian elephant from an African one by its ears, its head shape, and of course its geography. Asian ones come from Asia, African elephants come from Africa. But zoologists can't be satisfied with this. They're duty-bound to investigate until they have established a holotype. I'm dead serious. Because think about it. How can we describe this world and claim to care about precision in the naming of all of its flies, fleas, and blind mole rats if we have this elephant in the room, if there's no clarity as to what we're holding up as the ideal, the reference, the holotype of the Asian elephant? So, the case was taken on by a large international group of scientists. This was only 12 years ago. But here's the good news. It turned out that way before Linnaeus, in 1664, a British naturalist named John Ray had described the skeleton of a different elephant during a trip to Florence, Italy. So that is 100 years before Linnaeus described his fetus. And crucially, Linnaeus cites Ray in his own description of the elephant. But here's bad news. Ray's 4-page description doesn't help us figure out whether his was an Asian or an African elephant. There's no illustration. But recently, zoologists dug around in the archives and fortunately realized that the skeleton that Ray described is actually still standing on display in the Natural History Museum of Florence. They extracted its DNA and proved that it belonged to an Asian elephant, making it a holotype, the Asian elephant of scientific record. They examined its teeth and bones and determined that this was a 25-year-old female, just as John Ray had said. So, now zoologists have holotypes for both the Asian elephant, the Florentine skeleton, and the African elephant, that fetus in a jar. And you might be wondering, why go through all this detective work? Why not just pick some fresh elephant skeleton today and make it the holotype of the species? The answer is because names in biology aren't just labels. They are promises. When Linnaeus or John Ray first wrote down a species name, that name became tied to a particular specimen. And that tie is what keeps science stable. If every new generation could swap out the holotype for a shinier, more convenient one, then the names would shift like sand. What we call an Asian elephant today could suddenly become something else tomorrow. So, scientists insist on finding the oldest specimen linked to the very first description, even if it means tracking down a jarred fetus from the 1700s or a forgotten skeleton in Florence. Because without that continuity, without that anchor in the past, the entire naming system would unravel. Conservation, medicine, everything that depends on knowing exactly which species is which would be chaos. One more detail. This entire investigation was brought to light a few years ago in the prestigious Zoological Journal of the Linnean Society, along with one more delightful tidbit. One of Rembrandt's surviving drawings depicts this very same female elephant, whose name was Hansken, when she was still alive, chewing a turnip in the menagerie. If you just Google it and look at her ears, I'm sure you will agree that she was, beyond a doubt, an Asian elephant. We're lucky with this elephant, but overall, the fate of scientific collections varies, and sometimes human conflict directly affects what befalls them. It's best when a collection has a caring owner. Yevdokia Reshetnik kept the sandy blind mole rat's holotypes in expedition crates covered with some rags in a museum hallway. This was the caring thing to do, as you will see. In 1941, when the Nazis occupied Kiev, the Bolsheviks took part of the collections to Siberia. Some of it ended up lost and never returned to the museum. But the crates with the blind mole rats stayed in the hallway. Their curator, Yevdokia Reshetnik, hadn't left the city. At that point, she was volunteering at the Kiev branch of the International Red Cross. Soon after, her focus shifted to captive Red Army soldiers. She fed them pea soup. A little while later, the Germans arrested and dismantled the entire Red Cross. When it became clear that Stalin did not intend to exchange prisoners of war, the prisoners were executed. In February 1942, Yevdokia Reshetnik herself was arrested and taken to the Gestapo. After 10 days of interrogation, she was released and resumed working at Zoology Institute, now under German management. Along with all other scientific organizations, this institute's goals were now strictly practical, no science. Its agenda was the protection of plants from vermin.
They created new commissions, and in the spring of 1942, a large number of new institutions were established. But the Nazis did a very thorough job of redoing everything the Nazi way, meaning everything had to be organized to benefit the Nazis and bring them closer to victory. That's why gophers, for example, became one of the Zoological Institute's research subjects. At the time, it was called the Institute of Plant Protection, and gophers were pests who could potentially endanger grain and vegetable crops in the occupied territory of Reichskommissariat Ukraine.
So, Yevdokia Reshetnik announced that she would focus on studying vermin, specifically the gophers, and besides, she had already been studying their taxonomy before the war. This decision had several advantages. The first and most important one was that she was now free to go out into nature and take her 14-year-old son with her out of the city and away from the Nazis. At his age, he was already in danger of deportation to Germany for forced labor. And Reshetnik collected 500 gophers for a fur coat for the Institute Director's secretary, and to this end, she was given large quantities of gauze, cotton wool, iodine, and boric acid, ostensibly for preparing those skins. And here we need a bit of context. One might be thinking of the war on the Eastern Front as Soviets versus Germans, but actually, there were strong and sometimes competing factions of Ukrainian armed units, which had their own different ideas about the future of Ukraine, all of them loathing the Soviets more than they did Germans. We know from several sources that Reshetnik handed these medical supplies, the gauze, the iodine, the cotton wool, she handed them over to Ukrainian partisans, specifically to members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Melnik faction. By that time, Melnik faction had fallen out with the German occupation authorities and gone underground.
Музей сотрудничал с партизанами, как теперь известно.
We now know that the Zoology Museum cooperated with the partisan forces, thanks to stories like the one about the gophers and the blind mole rats. For example, I know for certain that large quantities of cotton wool, gauze, alcohol, and iodine were distributed under the pretext of preparing rodent skins. This is recorded in memoirs from the period. But all these supplies, or most of them, went to Kakharlik, the center of the partisan movement. And that also meant traveling to Kakharlik to catch large numbers of gophers. There were no blind mole rats there, but there were plenty of gophers.
In 1943, as the Reds approached Kiev, many collections from local institutes were removed, either by the Germans or by the zoologists themselves, who evacuated west with Germans. But Reshetnik once again stayed behind. All the while, she kept the blind mole rat skull collection in old expedition crates covered with rags in the institute corridors, like I told you. And she was lucky again. It turned out that the Germans blew up the neighboring building during their retreat in 1943, and not the institute itself. They also didn't bother taking such unremarkable crates to Germany, her second stroke of luck. After the war, Reshetnik's son and husband was sent straight to labor camps, to the Gulag, for their connections with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. In 1951, it was Yevdokia Reshetnik's turn. Those partisans she was helping were actually of that group. And for the KGB, these were the worst, as bad as it gets. The 4 years she spent in the labor camp left her with an enduring hatred of the Soviet regime, which she carried until the end of her life, and she died in 1995 in what became independent Ukraine after the fall of the Soviet Union. Shortly before her death, she wrote the following, as if speaking to her descendants, and this now sounds prophetic. God forbid you once again fall into bondage to the Moscow barbarian horde and let them muzzle your souls. People, be vigilant. Over the next few decades following the war, the sandy blind mole rat skulls spent their time under those rags without much adventure. And then, they just completely vanished, leaving almost no hope of ever being found. Here's how it happened. In the 1980s, a zoologist named Pasechnik had Reshetnik's collections sent to the Ukrainian city of Nizhin to study the structure of the blind mole rat's head, that amazing nature-designed shovel, perfect for digging. This kind of thing was allowed. For example, I myself have borrowed collections from the Zoological Museum when I was working on my PhD and then taken them to my own zoology department at my uni. So after Perestroika and Ukraine's independence, Pasechnik abandoned the topic and in fact science altogether. The boxes of blind mole rat skulls ended up in his garage. He simply forgot about them. Would they ever be found? And why should we care? If those dusty boxes with skulls just vanish, how would it harm science? And most importantly, how would it harm that furry animal itself? Well, actually, this is the part of our story where things are worst for the sandy blind mole rat as a species. Its holotype remained out of reach of museum scientists for close to 25 years. If the holotype had disappeared for good, and no zoologists had taken an interest in it, the species might have been forgotten forever. End of story. This kind of thing sometimes happens, let's say with a rare fly species and the like. If someone were to eventually realize what was happening, then the procedure would have been as follows. An international commission of blind mole rat specialists would convene. First, they would need to all agree with the conclusion that this species was in fact a valid one, and confirm that since Ogniev's time, zoologists hadn't lost faith in its validity or downgraded its status. Then, they'd have to prove that the holotype was truly lost. After that, new expeditions would be sent to the same nature reserve as before to make sure the sandy blind mole rat had not gone extinct. Then new specimens would need to be captured and their skulls compared with the old illustrations to confirm that the characteristics and the differentiation from other species matched the original descriptions, and only then would these new collections be solemnly declared the new standard for the species. This type of rediscovered reference for a species isn't called a holotype, now it's called a neotype. But this story turned out differently, because Igor Zagorodnyuk, our guest, who earlier was telling us the story of this animal, devoted his life and energy to the study of migration. And not the migration of animals, the migration of museum collections. And he ended up saving the sandy blind mole rat holotype. In 2004, Igor Zagorodnyuk left Kiev, the capital, and began working at Luhansk University in eastern Ukraine. He describes it as a fascinating place to study the animals of the Eurasian steppe. He spent 10 years there, teaching, collecting new specimens, and tracking down old historical collections. Back in Kiev, he had had the opportunity to meet both Reshetnik and her son, so he was well aware of the history of the sandy blind mole rat collection. Igor eventually found out where the skulls had gone, and sent his graduate student, Serhiy Zaika, remember that name, to travel to Nizhyn. And Serhiy found the little boxes with the skulls.
You
won't believe it. In a garage, behind a door, buried in the dirt. Those collections are still covered in traces of clay to this day. They dug them out for me. They had just been buried under debris and whatnot, but they were there. Fortunately, they were there.
Once they cleaned off the red clay and opened the boxes, it became clear that inside were the priceless holotypes. They rescued our furry hero, ensuring that the sandy blind mole rat retained its status as a recognized species.
While my colleague and I were working on a review of blind mole rats, I noticed a specimen that was labeled with the same number 5 in the same handwriting. It was a photo of a drawing of the skull in an article, if you can imagine, with a description of this Spalax arenarius, the sandy blind mole rat.
In other words, Igor knew Reshetnik's article so well that he was able, at a glance, to recognize a skull from her 1939 paper just by memory. That's what this profession is all about.
It's right there in front of me. For a zoologist, that's pure awe. And when you realize this is the most unique mammal species in all of Europe, well, what more can I say?
And then came 2014. Russians started a proxy war in eastern Ukraine, and Igor soon had to flee Luhansk, carrying only a small backpack and a hard drive hidden in his sock. He believes he was no more than a day away from his death. Once again, war among humans was threatening the status and survival of the sandy blind mole rat. When he fled, Igor didn't dare take the skulls with him in his backpack. Luhansk is a city in the east of Ukraine, which was occupied by Russian-backed militants 10 years ago and heavily shelled by the Ukrainian army since then in attempts to retake it. So every time I report on Ukrainian scientists dying or suffering during the current war somewhere in central Ukraine, I get comments from some Russian listeners asking, but what about those poor scientists from Luhansk, which is being attacked by the aggressors from Ukraine? This is Kremlin propaganda. I'd like to dedicate this next part of our story to those listeners.
There were people running around the university with assault rifles. I asked them to leave and stop disturbing my classes.
According to Igor, these men searching the university were scouring the entire city for the Ukrainian independence supporters.
Я не знаю, но
I don't know what they wanted from me, but I did manage to find out that one of my students was stopped at a separatist checkpoint and had his phone confiscated.
и у него изъяли телефон.
Our military volunteers who had already left Luhansk by then with the Ukrainian army told me this and said I had 24 hours to disappear because they were definitely coming for me.
Точно придут.
So, while actual Ukrainian fighters left the city by then, an elderly professor with Kiev ties would be the likely next target for Russia-backed separatists.
Уехал я под видом поездки.
I escaped by saying I was going on a trip to a biological field station on the outskirts of the city, and that was it, I was gone. But you have to understand, taking any kind of device with me was terrifying. They could arrest people for anything, even tear out the hard drives. But I had to get at least one hard drive out because I suspected I'd never be able to return. I had so much information stored on it. I run a scientific society. I keep the complete journal archives. I manage several websites, all saved offline on that drive. And all of it could have been lost forever. I was supposed to leave everything behind. When I left, all I had were ankle boots, summer shorts, and a small backpack. I watched the separatists spot-checking people at the railway station. It was bad. I was lucky to run into one of our university staff members. She was pregnant, almost at term, so they didn't touch her. Together, we managed to sort out her travels. And that's how I managed to get the hard drive out. A week or two later, while already in Kyiv, I got two of my former students to visit my office, and they managed to extract a sizable portion of the collection.
Which included more than just the blind mole rat holotypes. Over his years in Luhansk, Igor Zagorodnyuk had managed, through countless investigations, to track down thousands upon thousands of historical specimens and bring them back into scientific circulation. Among the sets he retrieved were some dating back as far as the 19th century. Skulls belonging to rodents and bats, insects, and spirit-preserved reptiles that had survived the Russian Civil War 100 years ago and both world wars. But now he had gone to Kiev, fleeing for his life, while the collections were left behind, stuck in a city seized and pillaged by men with automatic weapons. And so the collection's safety, including the fate of our sandy blind mole rat holotypes in their dusty old boxes, was once again hanging in the balance.
So in 2014, between the end of July and the end of August, maybe even early September, Luhansk had nothing. No running water, no electricity, no cell service. The entire city was at a standstill. Public transport wasn't running. And the trains weren't working either, obviously. But then for a little while, they started running again. So at that point, they were able to send me a few of my suitcases. Plus refugees, colleagues, former students. One by one, whoever was traveling out would bring me at least one suitcase. I ended up with around 8 to 10 suitcases filled mostly with the collections and some of my own things. I couldn't get my books out.
Some people didn't leave. Remember the graduate student Serhiy Zaiko, the one who had discovered the blind mole rat skulls in a garage in Nizhin? Well, he stayed in Luhansk in 2014. According to Igor, he did so because of a cat. Like all other pets, the cat wasn't legally allowed to leave Luhansk. Serhiy's mother-in-law refused to go without the cat, and his wife refused to go without her mother, so they all ended up staying. Not long ago, on the day of my first interview with Igor, Serhiy was killed, fighting on the Russian side. He had been drafted. Ever since, Igor Zagorodnyuk identifies as a refugee. He says that since fleeing to Kyiv, he's moved apartments a dozen times. The collections, including the sandy blind mole rat skulls, move with him. Last year, he finally sent the collections back to their original home, the Kyiv National Museum of Natural History. But with the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the sandy blind mole rat was imperiled once more. The situation was this. Museum specimen storage facilities require annual pest control. Without it, Specimens could fall prey to any number of tiny beetle species whose larvae feed on bones. The first spring of the Russian invasion, the museum staff, despite constant bombardment, still came to work, often walking for hours if the transport was on halt, to carry out the anti-pest treatment, risking their lives. Some museums in Ukraine have suffered serious damage. Explosive blasts shatter windows, leaving storage facilities vulnerable to pest infestation. Igor Zagorodnyuk is sheltering in a rental flat. He refused to evacuate from Kiev, saying his heart is weak and he can no longer afford to live as a vagabond. He also doesn't leave his apartment when the air raid sirens sound. He once tried going to a bomb shelter, but didn't like it. Instead, he explains how to set up a makeshift shelter in your hallway, and he's very proud of his system. So, he recommends choosing a spot between two load-bearing walls and stocking it with enough supplies to survive under rubble for several days. His own supplies include a chair, a first aid kit, and food, which he regularly refreshes, swapping out apples weekly. After each siren, he puts on a warm sweater, heads to the hallway, and waits out the amount of time it would take a missile to reach its target. Then he returns to his desk, always keeping his cell phone in his pocket. Zagorodnyuk sleeps in a hat to protect against cuts from flying glass shards, and keeps the kitchen balcony door open so that, in the event of a strike, the pressure inside his apartment doesn't blow everything up. Some of the Ukrainian scientists whose work I've been covering were, for a time, unable to continue their scientific work because of war. Igor's story offers an interesting counterexample. Faced with the outbreak of war, his instinct was to double down on science, almost obsessively. Even as he spent hours on the phone arranging housing for fellow scientists fleeing the conflict, he still found time to write and edit stacks of scientific papers. Here's how he describes what he did at the start of the war.
Естественно, после этого не только сна не было, а после этого наступает стресс.
At that point, sleep was obviously out of the question, but even worse was the kind of stress that takes over. You feel frozen, your whole body shaking, even though you're not actually cold. Then you shift into action. Everyone's glued to the news, trying to figure out how to help. I was doing what I could to help my colleagues find places to go because of my, well, not exactly status, but the nature of my work. All the organizations, the annual conferences. I happen to know a lot of people around the country and a lot of places where people could stay. I managed to get some work done during that time. I finished 2 volumes of journals. It was hard to find authors. And I compiled 2 more upcoming volumes. I want people to see that, despite everything, we're still working. We're not dead. We haven't been destroyed. Of course, I had to bug my colleagues, but I also feel like there's a small hidden benefit to that. It gives people a bit of a distraction. Your brain's not working? Do something. Just browse Google Scholar, type in a few useful keywords related to your topic. That's my secret move. I don't put it that way to my colleagues, but I keep nudging them, gently pushing in every possible way.
We recorded this interview during the first spring of the Russian invasion. I've stayed in touch with Igor ever since. The entire habitat of the sandy blind mole rat was occupied since then. A few years into that, Russians exploded a giant dam, flooding the area temporarily and then causing a catastrophic habitat loss. Zoologists who were the staff of the nature reserve were fighting for their lives. Every boat was confiscated before the flood. Some of them managed to escape into the free world, and the rest stayed under the occupiers, and they can't be impartial for obvious reasons, so it's impossible to reliably find out the exact numbers of the sandy blind mole rat population now. But from little evidence I could obtain, zoologists are most worried about constant shelling, not as much about flooding. There's not a single patch of land there that wasn't shelled or burned, many mammals suffering disturbance and concussions. And thus, the ordeal of that rare bizarre creature and the people who study it continues. That's our episode of the Naked Mole Rat podcast by Libo Studio. Follow and listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed it, please share the podcast with your colleagues, friends, and anyone else who might be interested. This will help us reach new listeners who will discover the accessible and fascinating world of science. The Naked Mole Rat is produced by Andrey Borzenko, Ilya Marritz, Danila Stapov, Anastasia Medvedeva, and Lika Kremer. Our sound editor is Ildar Fattakhov. Special thanks to this episode's scientific consultant, zoologist Nikolai Formozov. My name is Ilya Kolmanovsky. Goodbye.